you are now screen sharing.
Okay. Well, very good. Yeah, this technology is amazing, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. We can certainly get started. Tim Flynn had just chatted 5-minute break to get another coffee. I don't know if does everybody want to take just a couple minutes? We'll make sure that we have you ready to go, Chris. So let's we'll start at 10:07.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Chris, do you just want to make sure that there's no delay on your end with advancing? Joe was having a little difficulty.
Yeah, I'll, no, it should be working okay.
Okay, you're fine then. Okay, great. Yay. And I'll just reintroduce you quickly. We have a few folks on today that I don't believe were on all day yesterday. So
Okay.
I'll just do a brief of your bio again when we get back together. Muting me. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Hopefully you got your coffee. If there's any bagels and lox and cream cheese left over from Jack West, feel free to grab one, and we'll get started again. So I'm pleased to welcome back again on day 2, Chris Dunn, president of Dunn Works LLC. Chris is a 45-plus year veteran of the beverage and ice industry. After 19 years in marketing and operations at Coca-Cola and Coca-Cola Enterprises, he started in the bottled water industry, working for the Suntory Water Group as VP, responsible for M&A prospecting, emerging business sectors, and marketing. He was senior vice president of Biota, the company that developed the first bottled water container made from sustainable PLA resin, and other startup ventures. After 5 years with NSF as their global beverage quality program, he retired to continue his consulting business. I don't know, Chris, this seems like a very active retirement.
Yeah.
For over 25 years, Chris has been involved with water and ice trade associations, serving as a chair of IBWA's Communications Committee and Water Cooler Europe's Environmental Sustainability Committee. He currently serves as treasurer of the International Council of Bottled Water Associations. He is designated by WQA as a certified water specialist, is an SQF practitioner, plant operator by Texas, and is a lead instructor for the FDA's Preventive Controls Qualified Individual, as well as Foreign Supplier Verification Program training. Chris has a BA from the University of Denver and an MBA from Emory's Wayzata Business School in Atlanta. Welcome back, Chris.
Thank you very much. And I want to congratulate the association on a great conference. Had the pleasure of listening in on several of them. I have to really commend Steve Tischler. I think his explanation of PFAS cleared up something that's been confusing me for the last 5 years. So, again, great job for all the speakers. This morning, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you might approach organizing your food safety system, because I think all of us sometimes feel overwhelmed with the amount of paperwork and documents that are increasing in the demands from various regulators. So, begin to notice right at the outset that I talk about a food safety system, because this is really more than just a plan. It also includes a very rigorous supplier assurance program, as well as comprehensive testing. So you can think of this as a three-legged stool that ensures that you can effectively organize and, most importantly, demonstrate to anybody that's auditing or inspecting you that you've got a comprehensive program to ensure safe food. Now, not to state the obvious, but I think it's been fair to say that food safety systems serve two masters. First, it obviously should help you produce safe food. It sets out a plan, procedures, checklists, SOPs, SSOPs, etc., that if you execute these, make your food safe and of superior quality. But secondly, it supports you when it comes time to prove your system to an auditor or a regulator. This might be a trade association audit. It could be a food safety certification system like SQF. It could be the military if you're wanting to sell to them, even a consumer who demands verification before they'll purchase your product. And then, of course, the government that wants to make sure you're doing things right. So there's nothing wrong with having a goal of achieving a perfect score on an inspection. So I'd ask the question and look for, hands raised, but I think all of you would say, that nobody's spending too little time on paperwork. It seems like at times it just gets overwhelming. The stacks of papers, the forms, the documents. So looking for ways on how you might improve your organization of this has the goal of reducing the overall time while still making it efficient and beneficial to food safety. So, the goal of all of these audit programs and the FDA walking in is they want you to demonstrate proficiency that you can protect against gaps in your food safety system that could result in a recall. So how you go about doing that, how you go about convincing them is obviously up to you. So don't misunderstand me. You should obviously be using your food safety planning system to manage your business. It should give you insights as to how you execute processes and procedures. It should guide you on what to focus on to maintain quality and safety. And inspecting and documenting what you're expecting is really management 101. The key is, how do you keep this from overwhelming you? So how is it that you can keep the paperwork from crushing you? And I mean, quite literally, I've seen stacks feet high. So what I've learned is focus. Keep your eyes on the goal. Anticipate what's happening, and then be ready for what you know you're going to be asked for by an auditor or a regulator. You know, ask yourself, do you know where everything is? How easy is it to follow? Do you have enough detail, and can you manage to keep it up to date? So organization obviously becomes the key. I'm going to take you through a 6-step process that you may find helpful. But I want to stress to you that this is by no means the only approach. Nor is this an approach that's endorsed by any regulator or auditing organization. It's simply the way that I found working with my clients that helps them put their arms around what, by anybody's definition, is a mountain of paperwork. So step 1 starts by setting up some notebooks with some tabs. Step 2 is to build an index for each of those tabs. You know, what are you going to have behind them? Step 3 is to separate the different documents within a tab. Now, I use pink sheets, quite literally, for this. Step 4 is to make sure you've got sheets for what's missing. I use green sheets because as you build this notebook, there's going to be pieces of information that aren't readily available, but eventually need to be there. Step 5 is to set up a separate notebook for supplier assurance. This is a place where there's a huge amount of paperwork, and the FDA is taking an increasingly sharper look at what you've got here. And then step 6 is to set up a separate notebook, or frankly, a series of notebooks for all the testing. Because as all of you know, bottled water probably does more testing than any other consumer product in the United States, maybe excepting baby food. And so with that comes a volume of paper. So these are the tabs that I start with. There's 24 of them. It started out, it was just convenient to have 3 sets of 8s. There's nothing wrong if you want to use more, you want to use less. It's whatever makes sense to you. So with tab 1, I start with the most important document, the food safety plan. And I'll remind everybody, there is no FDA standard or format. The only requirement is that it be comprehensive. So remember your audience, you know, who's going to really use this notebook? And the goal is, frankly, not to make it as short as possible, but to try to anticipate every possible question that you think an auditor might ask. And so I'm the first to admit to you, and you know, some people will absolutely define my books as being overkill, and I'm fine with that, okay? Because I start with the questions I know will be asked. I finish with the questions that might be asked. And it's totally up to you as to how much detail you want to include. You know, there is no grade for your notebook. You know, the only score that counts is how you end up with the inspector or the auditor. You know, were you able to answer every question to their satisfaction? And if your answer is yes, hey, you're golden. If your answer is no, well, then think continuous improvement. But what I have learned over the years is that the shorter an audit is, the easier it is. So the more you can answer the question almost as soon as it's asked, the faster it's going to go. When you're scrambling for documents, that gives an auditor or an inspector time to think, gives them time to look around, gives them time to think of new questions. So again, the goal here is to demonstrate your proficiency, answer all the questions, and do so as quickly as possible. So I'm not embarrassed to say that my food safety plans need a table of contents. You know, I'm trying to set the tone right from the start. This is a not too subtle message to say, bring it on. Any question that you ask, I've got the documentation and the support to show you that we're in compliance. In the second tab, I know one of the things that auditors are often going to ask for is, hey, can I have a flow diagram or a plant schematic? You know, because maybe they've never been in your plant before and they kind of want a roadmap of how things are laid out. Now, I know you could say, well, I have diagrams in my food safety plan already. But, you know, I really prefer not to have to rip those pages out of the notebook. I like to have one that's already pulled out, it's stapled. I can just turn around and hand it to the auditor and say, fine, here it is. Now, obviously, those processes ought to begin with your sources and kind of walk them through your treatment, your packaging, your bottling, and any other relevant steps. If you do bottle blowing, you ought to have a diagram of how that's working. That plant schematic, again, it's not required, but it helps them kind of get an overview of how you have things laid out. It's also a place where you can kind of demonstrate to them that you pretty much have hand washing within sight of anybody inside your production area. Again, these are messages that you don't have to broadcast, but trust me, I've been an auditor, I pick up on them. And the more that you feel the client is prepared, the more that they've anticipated the questions, the less you feel compelled to have to really dig to understand how good they are. Here's an example of an index page behind the tab. I listed the information on source water. State right up front, most of you are probably using a public water supply. I'll have process flows to let them know the types of water I'm doing, if it's spring water or purified water, distilled water, whatever it happens to be. I try to make it as clear as possible. You'll see I actually include a Google Earth map of the bottling plant. Now, why do I do this? Is it in the regs somewhere? No. But I want to send them a message that part of my hazard analysis, frankly, was looking at where my bottling plant is located in the broader space. If there was a junkyard next to me, or if there was something that could potentially contribute contamination, I'd want them to know that I was aware of it. I wasn't running away from it. So again, you don't have to include any of these things, but maybe it saves a question later on. When you get to the third tab, it's all about licenses and permits. So, right from the outset, I'll go ahead and keep a copy of the last time I did my FDA facility registration update. Okay, it's just literally a page print from the screen that you use. I'll have copies of any state or local operating permits. Now, sure, I could walk them out to the lobby and I could point to the sign on the wall and say, here's my license. But it's just as easy to make a photocopy of it and say, you want to see it? Here it is. I'll have a copy of my recent water bill if I'm using a public system. I'll have any copies of certifications. Maybe I have SQF in the plant. Maybe I have a third-party certification from an audit from NSF or an ISO organization. Maybe I have a franchise agreement from Culligan. If I'm a member of IBWA, I'll have a copy of that. Again, these are all things that send the message to the auditor that I know what I'm doing. The index is a reminder to me as I put these notebooks together, just to make sure I don't leave anything out. Now, backflow prevention inspections in some states is mandated to be done by a third-party inspector. So if that's the case, I'll go ahead and just include them here, because that's almost always something that an auditor wants to see. I'll also put copies of my labels. Typically when you order caps from Silgen or Blackhawk, you're going to get a 8.5 by 11 page. It's going to blow up that paper label. And I don't have anything to hide. I want to show them that the labeling is accurate. It has all the requisite information. And, it just saves them from having to go out into the warehouse and squint at some bottle cap, in the warehouse area. Again, this is not required, but I know that I've had auditors tell me they appreciate it, that I've made it easier for them to get the information. I mentioned that I use pink sheets. I wasn't kidding, literally pink sheets, because as you're flipping through a notebook, it helps separate the different sections. It's just something that makes it easier for me to get through. And again, also, I do quite literally use green sheets. Nobody has all the information when they start to put together a notebook. It's always, hurry up and wait, gathering information. You've parsed out a lot of the responsibility to your team, so different people finish at different times. So you put these in as placeholders, explain what it is that eventually needs to go here, and then it's very easy to see what you're missing from your notebook. Tab 4 talks about the food safety meetings, and this is where I put notes. I encourage you to put notes about any kind of meetings that talk about food safety. Now, in the old days, and I can use that term, there used to be a requirement that you would have at least one HACCP meeting each year. Nowadays, the FDA expects this to almost be continuous. And real world, not too many of you actually convene a formal food safety meeting. What typically happens is you meet as a management group. It could be once a week, it could be once a month. So all you need to do is, if you spend 5 or 10 minutes in that hour-long meeting talking about food safety, go ahead and document it. Doesn't have to be, a long form. It doesn't have to be typed, but just, the date, the key points you talked about, who was there, and put it behind this tab. I suggest that you probably do this once a month or more often. Also be sure that if you're talking about food defense, that you can just as easily put your meeting notes behind this tab. So again, no requirement from the FDA other than you have at least demonstrate you meet it at least once, but more is typically better. Don't overlook any documentations that go along with corrective actions. Typically, you've had an audit, maybe there's been a problem identified, and these things don't instantly cure themselves. It may take you a month or 2 or 3. Maybe it's a capital budget item that you've got to order to achieve compliance. So these are things that, whether you've documented it or not, I know you're talking about them. I know that you have meetings with your staff and you review where you are. So I'm just suggesting you take that extra step, fill out a page with half a dozen bullet points on it and put it behind the tab. When you show this to an auditor, again, it's a message, hey, food safety is more than, just lip service. It's really a part of how I manage my business. The 5th tab I dedicate to traceability and recall. So if anybody reads FDA guidance documents, they know that this is a hot button. And by the way, you can count on a lot more coming over the next couple of years. But clearly they want to know what your traceability program is. You are required by law to be able to trace your product at least to the first point of sale. You're also required by law to be able to trace backwards any of the ingredients or materials that you used in the production of your product. You must have a method of product coding. So put it on a page, make it easy. It doesn't have to be, intuitively obvious. You can use codes or whatever it is, but you want to be able to explain that, very quickly I can educate whomever needs to be on how I code the product so that they could retrieve a particular batch. And then, of course, actually include your recall plan. And that recall plan needs to have the team members with their 24/7 contact information. It should also have state and federal regulators and any other information that you put together for your recall plan. The other thing that I'll do in addition to my own date codes is if I'm purchasing product from somebody, let's say I have somebody co-pack my 24 packs, I'll have a sheet in there that explains how they do their batch coding, because it may well be different from how I do it. I might also, well, I definitely would have my mock recalls. Now, the rule of thumb for records under FDA guidance is that you must have at least 2 years of food safety records. And that's 2 years from the production or purchase of any product or ingredient or material used in finished product. I found the most practical way is take the past 2 calendar years. So we're sitting here in 2020, I would have all the records for 2018 and 2019, and then be filling in 2020. At the end of 2020, and I'd go through this and I'd get ready for 2021, I would take all the records that belong to 2018 and probably put them in a separate notebook. And the reason I would continue to hold on to some of these is that while FDA has a record requirement of 2 years, IBWA still has a record requirement of 5 years for some of the information. So, I'll keep those prior years in a notebook, and then as they rotate off, I'll get rid of them. In this section, I would also have any actual recalls. God forbid we don't ever want to have one, but if you did, you'd be obligated to keep those written records And if it were a public recall, the FDA would know already coming in there that you had one. So if you didn't show it to them, they might start getting a little suspect. You know, once it's happened, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. What you want to do is prove that you were effective in actually executing the recall and that you had the regulator's blessing on closing it out. And you'd also, of course, have your mock recalls. And, you know, there is a requirement, you know, that you test your system. Now, on trade association audits, that means doing a mock recall once a year. I think SQF might be doing it twice. You know, the FDA doesn't ask specifically for a mock recall. It just uses this phrase that you have to test your system. When you show them the mock recall, that satisfies their question. Tab 6 is devoted to food defense and intentional adulteration. So you're going to basically cover two topics. The first, food defense, you know, how are you protecting your facility and your product? Now, we've had various requirements around food defense really since the Bioterrorism Act of 2004, I think it was. It's probably going to be a multi-page document. It's going to lay out the general procedures and programs that you have. It's called food defense, but you know, actually in Canada, I think they refer to it as food security. It's the focus on the micro aspects of your business. You know, how you, you know, lock doors, keep the facility secure, maybe do some screening of employees, you know, general things that all contribute to security of the plant and your food. Now, if you're a large organization, if your annual revenue exceeds $10 million collectively, including your year-end inventory, well, then you are also required to have an intentional adulteration program. It's one of those terms, you know, you say it 3 times and you end up with something different. But at the end of the day, what the FDA is looking for are certain key activity types that they find present in large food plants that could potentially result in a significant risk to the food supply. So you're asking yourself, well, you know, is this really an issue for bottled water? And again, we are not talking about somebody taking a hypodermic needle and injecting a single 5-gallon. That's really under food defense. What we're very concerned about, and what the FDA's research has shown, is that if I wanted to mess with the nation's bottled water, I'd go and try to contaminate perhaps a water storage tank. If I could get into a 20,000-gallon tank, put some type of contaminant, that would impact a lot of 5-gallon bottles. And then your mineral injection system. So if you use trace minerals for your product, that's probably the most vulnerable place in your bottling plant. As you think about it, all somebody has to do is lift up that lid, pour in a cup of something, and you know, you could be producing 5, 10, 15,000 units before you ever knew there was anything in there. So there is a format as to how you look at your vulnerabilities. There's a format as to how you assess, you know, what the potential risk or consequences is. And if you're a large plant, you've already hopefully been dealing with this. If you're a small plant, focus on the food defense plan and you should be fine. One critical part of both, though, is the training. So for everybody, there is an FDA training course. It's called Food Defense 101. It's free, it's online, and it's really that first line of defense. And the expectation increasingly is that every employee in your plant, including front office staff, has taken this course. And it typically takes about 30 minutes online. You print off a certificate, you're good to go. So again, I would have my food security or food defense plan. If I did security inspections, again, that's based on my risk assessment, I would have those in here, and then I'd have my vulnerability plan. Tab 7 is about process preventive control validation. If I have one of these, and again, you learned in PCQI class, they're not required, but pretty common to find a bottled water company that uses ozone as a final disinfection. So they're going to expect that you've got the three components of a validation. You have the theory or the practice, that you've got details on how that's actually installed in your plant. And then you've got your monitoring strategy to be able to demonstrate that that control, in fact, works. Again, you'll see these three parts. I think that there's nothing too complicated about them. If you've been to any of the workshops that I've done with the different regionals, you probably already have copies of some templates to use. Same thing would be done if you happen to declare UV as your process preventive control. And some of you who do spring water might use that instead of the ozone, just to protect against the bromate. Anything else, same approach, but we don't find those very often anymore. Tab 8, I dedicate to source water. Now this can be pretty simple. If I am only using a public water supply, then really all I need to do is, show that receipt from the public water, that I purchase it. I'd want to definitely have my consumer confidence report to show them at least I'm taking a look at what that system puts out publicly. It'd be really nice if you had a page in there that, kind of drilled down into that system a little bit more. We're finding that these consumer confidence reports are getting, bland is a nice word. I think when they first came out, they had some meat on them, but now the marketing people and the lawyers have gotten a hold of them, and very rarely do you actually see anything that even smells of something problematic. When in reality, the plant could be operating under variances from the EPA. They could have contamination. They could have boil alerts. They could have coal alerts that happen day in and day out, but under current regulations don't require public notice. So do a little bit of due diligence. Again, I always ask the question, I'll show by a raise of hands, how many of you know the supplier that you buy your bottles from? And usually at least half of you will raise your hand. And then I'll say, well, how many of you know the manager of your local water treatment plant? And maybe there's a few. Just think to yourself, shouldn't I know the supplier of 99% of my raw ingredients? Shouldn't I be on a first name basis with them? Shouldn't I have a little bit more than just a PR puff piece that they publish on the internet? In a perfect world, I'd even want to know what the last mile of pipe is. Am I one of those people that have legacy lead pipes? I have a responsibility to know that. So again, this is where I put that information. If I were using spring water or well water, I'd probably include my Title 21 here that I'm required to do. If I'm purchasing spring water from a third party, I'd have all of their information, just so I could show that, I've done my due diligence on that spring water site or well water. If I'm using a tanker and it's a third party, this is where I could put in wash tickets that I ask them to provide me at least on a monthly basis. So whatever you think helps you prove to an auditor or inspector that you've done a lot of due diligence on the source water that you use to make your product. So again, if you don't have spring water, just go ahead and say that. That way, asked and answered without even having to spend time on it. Slide 9, I get into the sanitation program. And this is obviously one of the key elements that an inspector is going to look at. You should have something that describes your program. You should talk about sanitizing returnable bottles. This is where I would put in that Excel sheet that many of you have seen, where we calculate the contact time to prove to an inspector that we're achieving that 0.5 contact for sanitizing the bottles. I would put a list of all of my equipment, the frequency with which I clean it. If I were practicing hygienic zoning, I would be talking about it in this section. Anything else that imparts the seriousness with which I do sanitation. If I had an ATP program, I might put a page in here summarizing that. Anything else that would support that, because that's a hot button, even more so in the world of COVID. In terms of your actual SOPs, or SSOPs. You can include them here, or I have later on their very own tab because they are so important. So this is, by the way, also where I would include your pest control program, your chemical control program, and even your cooler cleaning program. So we know that, you know, the FDA is not particularly interested in how you clean coolers. You know, it's not part of your food manufacturing process. But some trade association auditors will ask questions, will want to look at your cooler cleaning. So it's not a bad idea to have your program here just to demonstrate to them that you apply the same kind of diligence cleaning your coolers as you do to keeping your production lines clean. Under maintenance, you know, again, this is your program. What do you do for preventative maintenance? A list of your equipment. How often do you do this? Now, you might wonder, you know, why is the FDA so focused on, you know, the maintenance of your machinery rather than sanitation? And the reason comes down to their research into recalls. Oftentimes, they're able to trace back the reason for the contamination comes about from a piece of equipment or an area of the plant that was not properly maintained. It was let to go. It started developing contamination. That could have been rust. It could have been other things that could have promoted you know, issues with sanitation. So they are increasingly asking you, you know, about this maintenance program. It's actually in the regulations. You know, you are required to do preventative maintenance. It's not optional because you can't have preventative controls unless your equipment has been properly maintained. So you'll see the procedures, the list. If you've got a form on how you track preventative maintenance paperwork, you should definitely include it here. You can keep manuals or other cross-referenced information. You know, if that's too bulky to put behind this tab, you can go ahead and put in a sheet of paper and says, you know, go to my chief mechanic's office and you'll see all of the preventive maintenance manuals on the shelf, whatever. Again, no method, no requirement, but how do you answer or anticipate and answer the question to move things along? When we get to tab 11, it's all about allergens. Now, we are very fortunate we deal in a product that has minimal allergen issues. When you've gone through PCQI class, you know, we breezed through this in a real short time because for the most part, we don't have to contend with allergens. The only issue that sometimes raises itself is if we happen to be using a form of carbon that originates from coconut shells, we would like to have some type of substantiation from the supplier that just says, look, this carbon, while it does come from coconut shells, has no coconut antigens and therefore has no potential allergen cross-control or cross-contamination. The second part to this, though, is that, you know, we do operate in plants where we have typically employee break rooms. And, you know, we do allow an employee to bring a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to the plant or, you know, a granola bar or something else. So it's not that we don't use allergens, but we do, in fact, have allergens sometimes on the facility. And here you need to articulate what you do to protect against these from getting into the production area. And as many of you have read the policies that I've drafted, it's not much more than saying we wash our hands every time we leave the break room. You know, we have a full-length mirror so I can inspect myself and make sure that there's no dribbling of peanut butter on my uniform shirt. It's very basic. It's one page. And I posted in the plant several places. That's all you really need to include under this section to demonstrate that you're in compliance. I'd also put that statement in several places. Make sure that visitors or contractors, when they walk in, see this policy. So right at your front entrance, along with the bulletin board that you typically have other employee notices on. Tab 12 gets into supply chain program. And again, this is probably one of the biggest changes that came about from preventative controls. The FDA has an absolute requirement that you must approve your suppliers prior to purchasing from them. It also says that if you have ingredients that you can't properly control inside the plant, you've got to establish supply chain preventative controls and explain how it is that you protect spring water that you purchase from somebody, or transporting it to your plant, or having a product co-manufactured for you. I think this is where you get into what I would call an overflow notebook, because just the amount of information tied to supplier assurance is a full notebook by itself. Again, we're talking about every supplier that you've purchased from or had materials from that are either less than 2 years old or you still have in use. So, what do I mean by that? Well, think about your returnable bottles. It's pretty common for you to have legacy bottles that, I've seen bottles 10 years old, okay? You are required by law to have the paperwork associated with those bottles. You've got to have a certificate of compliance or something that demonstrates that that supplier 10 years ago followed FDA guidance, and so that container that you're still using today is just as safe as one that you bought new from your current supplier. So think about how many different bottle suppliers you've had over the years. Think about the rack suppliers, how old some of your racks are. Think about sometimes you use more than one cap supplier. You may have multiple cleaning and sanitizing chemical suppliers. You may have equipment suppliers that sometimes that equipment could be 20 years old, but the FDA says you still need to have documentation that proves that that equipment is safe for a food environment. So, I've put together quite literally its own notebook. I'll try to identify who the suppliers are, get baseline information on each of them, some kind of FDA reference on why they're suitable, any technical data that's applicable. Love to have a certification, something like an NSF non-food compound or Standard 61. And this information has to be looked at least annually to make sure that if anything needs updating, that you've gone ahead and requested it from the supplier. Typically, the rule of thumb is documents that attest to the conformity of the product, the fact that the bottle resin is safe, should be at least no older than about 2 years. I can't say that you'll get a nonconformance if it's 3 or 4 years, but again, they will ask for newer information just to make sure that that supplier didn't have a change in formula. And this has become particularly relevant as suppliers have tried to make sure that they don't have BPA, they don't have any PFAS in the way that they manufacture their products. So, I'll keep this information. I'll title it, supplier assurance. I actually start out with 50 tabs. And you might say, God, that's a hell of a lot. But just start adding up all the things that you use in your bottling plant. And I'm typically, when I do a first draft of a notebook, I'm right up there in 30 or 40. So I'm just allowing a little bit of room for growth. And by keeping this in a separate notebook, it makes it easier to organize. It's one place to go to, and it can be an easier process. What I'll always start with is a list of those suppliers in the front. So again, you've got things like mineral suppliers. How many of you have changed mineral suppliers? It's very common. We talked about different bottle suppliers, different cap suppliers. You'll create an information form. And then some kind of certificate of compliance. And, I'll share with you that if you purchase from somebody like Allied Purchasing, oftentimes they will help you gather this information. The good news is with word processing, once you create one of these, it's pretty easy to duplicate and have them for others. So, again, maybe not in the notebook, but back in your primary book behind tab 12, you're going to have information on raw materials and how you handle them, how you receive your spring water, and then most importantly, any co-manufactured product. So a lot of information, very voluminous. So the better you can organize this, the easier you'll find it. Tab 13, I devote to training. And I think everybody recognizes that training has gotten a lot more emphasis and interest. So you got to start out by summarizing, what training program do you have? Do you develop it yourself? Do you use outside services? You've got to show, how do you keep track of this? Typically, you've got some kind of form that's dedicated to each employee, and you're tracking all the training from the moment they walk into a plant, and you give the basic introduction through to teaching them preventative maintenance procedures or how to manage the ozone control or whatever else. This is also where you would put in outside training. So hopefully you've got somebody in your plant that's a preventative controls qualified individual. Print their certificate. The same thing if you have an IBWA CPO, print their certificate. If they've got a WQA certification, print the certificate. If they've done food defense training, print that certificate. Again, you get to see, it doesn't take much to build up the paper, but by going ahead and having this and keeping it in one place, it keeps the job pretty easy. You don't have to go around to different file cabinets. It's all contained in one place. Visitors policy. Obviously, this has become pretty important in the world of COVID. You need to control visitors into your plant. The FDA is a little fuzzy as to, does somebody actually have to sign their name? But it's probably considered best practice that you have a log, where they're from, who they're there to see, what time they came. And again, this is part of your food defense. If you ever had an issue, you'd want to go back and see who came in your plant. Increasingly, it's a part of your COVID defense. One of the things that I encourage people to have is something that deals with COVID. So this particular form that I use with my clients comes from the CDC. It's the typical questions that you should be asking somebody that you don't know that walks into your plant. And it reminds them that they need to wash their hands, they need to wear a face mask, or whatever other requirements that you have. So again, if you're not doing something like this, I strongly encourage that you go back and develop it. I think that Joe Doss mentioned that IBWA has put out a guidance document that's very useful. They've taken everything that FDA and OSHA have been recommending and put it together in a guidebook. And in here, you'll see different templates and information to help you develop your own program. Tab 15 looks at consumer complaints. And the auditors want to know, how do you manage this process? Do you write them down in a notebook? Do you put them into a computer system? What happens if a consumer wants to try to get a hold of you after hours? Is there a way to do that? If you've got a form that somebody fills out, good idea just to include the form. And frankly, any that have been, completed over the past 2 years. I mean, my experience, we're talking, certainly less than 10. I mean, a few at most. We have a great track record on quality and safety. So complaints don't happen often, but anytime that they do, we ought to be taking them seriously, and we ought to be resolving them and documenting that in writing. Tab 16, I deal with corrective actions. And again, this is all about how do you track things that go wrong. And any FDA auditor that I've ever talked to will say that if a plant tells them they've never had a failure, all kinds of red flags go up, okay? Because we operate in a business, there's a lot of machinery, a lot of moving parts, and the idea that you can be perfect and never have a failure, you bottle water, you don't walk on water. So I would just suggest to go back and look at your procedures, and when things do go wrong, okay, own up to it, document it. Why did it happen? There's a basic 6-step process that you use to follow for corrective actions. It starts with things like root cause analysis, looks at what are you going to do to prevent this, who's going to be responsible, any information, pictures, whatever it happens to be. So, this is, again, if you've got any of these, they should be included behind this tab. And this applies for at least the past 2 years. So, if you, and realize that, for instance, if you're using ozone as your process preventative control, and for some reason the alarm goes off and your ozone drops below the critical level, The FDA fully expects to see documentation on that. They fully expect to see that the line was stopped, the product was quarantined, that you resolved the issue, that you restored control, and then you closed out what you did with that product. Now, more often than not, we get fairly casual. We have a problem, and what happens? Somebody goes back and says, let's dump the last 20 bottles, and then you keep moving on. Excuse me. The FDA wants to see what you did in writing, okay? It's not that they don't trust you, but frankly, they think a discipline needs to be followed here. Because anytime you violate a process preventive control, you're raising your hand and saying, this is what keeps my product safe, and it wasn't working. So that's a big, serious potential issue to the FDA. Tab 17, we start getting into just a place to hold documents. So over the course of your managing a bottling plant, you're going to have developed policies, different checklists, different logs, all kinds of forms. I use a pink sheet to kind of separate them into different categories, and I put copies here, okay? And again, for policies, I typically list them out because I know a lot of auditors are asking about them. So you'll see, mock recall. One thing in there, and I know this is really hard to read, but I have something I call SOP 14, Acknowledgement of Food Safety Policies. One of the documents that the FDA is increasingly looking for is some way to prove that your employees understand that you actually do have policies and procedures, okay? That, wearing a face mask or using gloves is not voluntary, it's not optional. It's a requirement. So, the FDA wants to know, well, how is it that you enforce that? And you might say, well, I do all kinds of training programs. And they'll say, well, show me where that employee acknowledges that they've got a responsibility to wear a mask. So on one form, we track, and anytime that we do a training class on a policy, we have the employee sign and acknowledge that they're aware of it. The other thing, and again, I don't think anybody can read the size of the font, but we've started adding an ozone policy. And I'm going to talk later this afternoon about ozone because I think it's something that we probably ought to be paying more attention to from a safety perspective than maybe what we've done in the past. Ozone is regulated by OSHA. It is considered a hazardous material. Now, I don't think the way we use it in the bottled water industry should cause anybody any concern. We know that the FDA views it as safe, but you're going to see in some of the material I present that there are people taking a closer look. So we want to make sure that our employees understand if they ever have an issue, if they ever have a concern, they know how to handle that and where to go. Tab 18, we get into the standard or the sanitary standard operating procedures. These are all your SOPs, SSOPs, I'm sorry. And again, I simply list them in order. If I've got 10 of them, there's 10. If I've got 50, there are 50. If my numbering skips around, I might slip a paper in there just to say, I don't have a number, 27. I skipped from 26 to 28. No big deal. It's a quick place to go. And an auditor might say, well, let me take a couple, look at a couple of them. Or they may just say, hey, you've got it covered, let's move on. The next tab I would have is on standard operating procedures. And again, these are all the procedures that instruct your employees on how to do things. And it's typically all the topics that don't directly focus on sanitation. So it begins, frankly, with document standards. Do you have a way to lay out all your checklists and forms to make it easy to follow, to know that you're using the most current version? You can have quite literally dozens of procedures in your plant. Now, a lot of these, you can write them one time and they're good for 10 years. Others have to be reviewed and updated more often. There's no magic number. There's no specific list of topics that you must have individual procedures for. It is whatever you think you need to be able to operate your plant safely. So I happen to list them just to make it easier to make sure we've included them. But again, how much or how little you want to include, totally up to you. Tab 20 gets into calibration because this is, again, under preventive controls, something that's required. Any instruments or equipment that you're using, to make definitive judgments, to take measurements, to evaluate results on, typically needs to be calibrated. So, what do you need? Well, probably first off, a list of all that equipment, and then what's required. So, you may have individual calibration forms. So, for instance, your incubator, your way to check the accuracy might be to have a bulb thermometer inside, and once a day, you check the temperature shown on the outside with the temperature shown on the inside, and you've checked the accuracy. You may have some standard solutions of pH, and if you've got a known pH of 4 and a known pH of 10, then you're able to calibrate your pH instrument. And so it goes for each of these instruments. Sometimes nowadays, probably more frequently, we're buying instruments. They're good for a year or 2 years, and then we just throw them away because they maybe cost more to actually calibrate than what it does to buy a new one. But remember things like if you have a UV system and you've got a meter, that meter must be calibrated, okay? None of them last for very long. They'll tell you that they're good for a year. I wouldn't trust them past one day past 1 year. They're cheap, they're flimsy, and if they get voltage spikes or other things, they can become pretty inaccurate. So when you have things like that, order a new one, and most of them are just kind of swap out and you put in the new device. Some of the newer equipment nowadays has software built into it that allows you to do calibration. That's fine, that's acceptable. Just make sure that you've got that procedure kind of maybe pulled out, photocopy it on its own page, so that there's no doubt that you know how this works. Tab 21, we get into the testing and laboratory results. And again, you're going to see, and I know nobody can read this, but we do a lot of testing. I think I mentioned before, we probably test more than almost any other food product in the country. So this generates an enormous amount of paper because everything has to be written down. Everything has to be kept. Everything has to be reviewed, signed off on by PCQI. So I think that this is definitely a place where you want to have a second overflow notebook, just because they take up a lot of space. And you're saying, well, how big are these notebooks? I'll share with you that the basic food safety notebook, my default size is a 5-inch binder. For supplier assurance, I start with either a 3 or a 4-inch binder. And for testing, I use a 5-inch binder. And usually you got to go to a second or third. I mean, just think about how many forms and test results that you generate. And if you say, well, I don't want to put them in a notebook, I just want to keep them in a file cabinet, that's fine. What I would suggest to you is just put in a piece of paper that says, this particular test is stored in filing cabinet 2, 3 hanging folders, I keep the information there. Perfectly acceptable. But, this is where you want to just help yourself to make sure that you've got all of these different items. I start with 8 tabs, and they're just general categories. You've got your Title 21 reports, your quarterly caps and containers. That's really important. That is your environmental monitoring program. This is probably a place where you want to keep long records. I mean, it really impresses an auditor when you can show them 10 years of caps and containers and you've had virtually 0 hits. I mean, that speaks volumes on how clean your plant is and how conscious you are about sanitation. We've got weekly finished product report, daily finished product, we've got quarterly bromates, we've got daily production, we got process preventive controls. I mean, we have a lot of paperwork. So keep it organized so that if you get asked about it, you're not having to search through the file drawers to find it. Then we get into audits and inspections. And Here we obviously want to keep any audits that have been conducted on the plant for at least the past 2 years. And again, I would suggest you keep that third, fourth, and fifth year so that you're in compliance with IBWA's regulations. Now you might ask, why am I so adamant about, only 2 years records? It has to do with, God forbid, none of you ever go through any kind of product liability lawsuits. But one of the first things you'll learn in any kind of lawsuit is the other side is going to ask for every single document that you have. And the courts are going to compel you to make photocopies of every single document that you have related to the subject. And they're not going to say, well, this incident happened last year, so just go back a year or two. No, that court order to you is going to say produce any and all documents. So if you've got 10 years worth of daily lab reports, you're going to have to physically copy 10 years of daily lab reports. It can be very expensive, very time consuming. So if you only have records so long as you need them, or so long as they are of direct benefit, I'm talking about like keeping annual testing of your spring site. That's something I'd want to keep forever, right? Because you'd want to see if your spring, if the chemical composition is changing, or the caps and containers to show that you've got a long history. But a lot of these other things, do you really need your daily ozone measurements past that 2-year requirement? I don't think anybody's ever gone back and looked at it. So, you got to really be disciplined and move that paperwork out of your system, once it's no longer necessary. But, I would keep track of all my inspections. I think those are very useful. They're great learning exercises. So, anytime the FDA's come in, the state, the military, OSHA, any trade associations, any third-party audits. This is also, frankly, a good place to keep a copy, if you happen to be an IBWA plant member, keep a copy of the plant inspection book, okay? Keep a copy of any self-inspections. All these things can be useful references, not just for the auditor, but just for your own team. Finally, we start getting down and we've got this tab 23, I just call it an all other. So, this is the catch-all, right? It's anything else that doesn't neatly fit behind another tab. It's miscellaneous questions. And this is totally dependent on your facility. If you've never been asked another question, if you've never been asked to produce another piece of information, this tab could be empty. Doesn't matter. But what some bottlers and some of my clients have found that maybe this is a place where you list your distributors. Maybe this is a place where you list your remote, distribution depots. Any other information, if you've been asked, it's just a tab to place it. And then lastly, I'm just giving you a tab to use on your own. And I know by now you're like really blurry. You can't read most of these slides because of the screens that we're working with, but everybody's food safety system is different, right? And what I've tried to show you here is one approach, but there's a lot of approaches that work. So you've got to be comfortable in how you can organize it. And if you want this one to be empty, that's no problem. I'll share with you what a couple of my clients have done is they've actually used this as a place to store the regulations. So, we keep talking about you're subject to FDA preventative controls, Part 117, or you're subject to Part 129, or you've got tests listed in Part 165. Do all of you have copies of those CFRs? And they're all available on the internet. So, this is a place, frankly, where when I'm preparing a notebook, I go ahead and I print the copies off and I have them there as a reference. And I'm not saying that everybody reads every page, but these are useful. And, even every time I go through them, I learn something. So this is the Bible. This is what a FDA regulator is going to hold you accountable for. And normally when a regulator comes into a plant, they don't have the pretty checklist that IBWA has or NSF has. They simply start with the regulations. And, they'll go 17, Part 117.1, point 2, point 3, point 4. So, if you're wanting to know the kinds of questions, read the regulations. It's pretty self-explanatory. So, I want to come back and stress that what I presented here today is just one approach. And it's okay for you to feel like it's way too much detail. It's fine with me if you want to say it's way too much paper. I mean, I chop down a lot of trees with the paper that I buy. And if you say, look, I keep my papers in filing cabinets and it's worked just fine for me for 10 years, then I say don't change, okay? But if sometimes you feel a little bit overwhelmed with all these new regulations and new documents and, you want a way to, to try to wrap your arms around, then feel free to use something like this. So, are there any questions or, I'm always interested in hearing from you if there are ways that you found, frankly, better ways. So I'm not sure how I go about reading chats, but somebody can let me know a question if there is one.
You should be able to see the chats on your screen as well, Chris. There hasn't been anything that popped up yet in chat or Q&A. Anyone is free to unmute themselves and open up discussion. So our next segment is a break, so we can take as much time as needed here to chat with Chris. I know I've, over the years, found all of your tips very useful in the assistance I've provided to clients in helping them organize their food safety plans, because it is a lot of trees that you end up putting together and trying to, come up with a way to organize it that makes sense, that you can find those documents. I realize I have not turned on my video all morning. I apologize for that, everybody. I really am here.
Okay.
I just keep forgetting to turn it on.
Well, and I know that, a lot of this, information is sometimes hard to read on a screen. So if you've got a question about any of these, feel free to give me a call. And I'll try to provide you some assistance. I think that everybody's got my contact information. So, I'd like to think the paperwork's gone away, but I don't see that happening. I think that the trend, quite frankly, is trying to push electronic. And I mentioned a guy named Frank Yanich from the FDA. He has something that when he goes out and gives speeches, he talks about food safety 2.0. And it would blow you away, the work that they are doing with the large consumer packaged goods companies as it relates to food safety. Talking about traceability, down to the, the individual peanut that's in a jar of peanut butter. These things with technology have really begun to increase. And again, it's a little bit scary, the idea that, you would allow the FDA to look in on all of your records, but, the alternative is you're going to have to print paper for all the records and documents that you have. And with every course of action, there's some pain and some gain. But I encourage everybody, get a system in place, because this stuff can quickly overrun you if you're not keeping up with it on a regular basis. Everybody's pretty darn quiet.
I know. And we gave them, I know Tim Flynn got coffee, hoping everybody else did during that break.
Can I just make a quick comment?
Go right ahead, Mike.
So this is Mike Carr. Chris helped me with this over the past 10 months to put this together in this format. And I just tell you that I had my audit here in the last month or so, and the auditor, he raved about our FSMA plan and how detailed and accurate it was. And I would also say that if you need help with it, you should ask Chris, because we were transitioning over from the old plan to the new plan and didn't know where to start and what to do and what the differences were. It was invaluable, the help that we received from Chris. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Well, thank you. Okay, well, I don't see any questions, so I'll look forward to joining you all this afternoon. And I know that, it's getting late in the day, but I'd really encourage you to listen in on this conversation about OSHA and ozone. I think it might be eye-opening because it's an issue that we don't talk a whole lot about, but I think we're going to start seeing, more activity, especially out of OSHA as it relates to this.
I would agree with you, Chris. So absolutely. So next we're going